We continue breaking down the best prospect pools in the NHL with teams 11 through 9. We've got the Minnesota Wild, the Philadelphia Flyers, and the Detroit Red Wings, all coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, Sebastian and I break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, but it's the summertime, so we're doing 3 times a week. I'm Hadi Kalikesh, joined by Sebastian High, and we will be going through teams 11 through 9 in our prospect pool rankings. We've got the Minnesota Wild, the Philadelphia Flyers, and then finally the Detroit Red Wings that we'll be breaking down for you. We'll talk about their top prospects, who's up and coming, who's come out of nowhere, who's fallen off the map. Everything you need to know about every prospect pool in the NHL is on this podcast. Now, before we get into any of it, just make sure to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always very much appreciated. So, Sebastian, let's start with the Minnesota Wild. Now, the main deciding factor that put them at 11th for us rather than higher up in the rankings, I think you'll agree on this, is Jesper Wallstedt. I think that's the defining piece here of this puzzle for the Minnesota Wild. Is Jesper Wallstedt the best goaltender prospect in the NHL? Would that be a fair statement?
He still is for me. I know you have a couple guys that are at least in contention with him, with Devin Levi and Dustin Wolf. And those are my top 3. I think Yaroslav Askarov would be number 4 in my personal ranking. But tight as it is towards the top end of that, I still would put Wallstedt ahead of every other goalie prospect in the league right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's very rare that you get the combination of intelligence and athleticism that Wallstedt brings. He reads the game extremely well. Post to post, very sound, very composed, doesn't overcommit. Really solid glove hand as well. There aren't many areas of weakness in Wallstedt's game, which makes him so enticing as a prospect. He can be a bit too calm at times. I like to see a bit more desperation in my goaltenders. That's why I like Devin Levi and Dustin Wolf as much, because they've perfectly tailored their game around the lack of size, and they're able to just turn on that desperation mode and turn into Gumby. It's funny to watch. But moving on from Wallstedt, who is, for me, probably the definitive best prospect in their pool. We do have a couple of runner-ups in there that are decent enough. Guys to figure in our top 5 would probably be the likes of Charlie Stramel. We've got, fortunately, Marco Rossi has just aged out. He played 20 games, so doesn't qualify as a prospect anymore. Another prospect I really like in their pool is Marat Khusnutdinov, who I'm a huge fan of. Ever since his draft year, he's been one of the guys I've kind of stuck my flag in and been like, this is my guy. And he's been looking really good so far. His defensive game has come in leaps and bounds. For you, the ad of Charlie Stramel in last year's draft, how do you feel about that specifically? Because I'm still conflicted about it.
I trust Minnesota's drafting so much that I'm not going to question the pick too much.
Yeah.
I personally would not have made it. I think Charlie Stramel is an intriguing prospect who could really develop a ton this year. Like, his draft year season in Wisconsin held him back a ton, and it makes him a tougher projection because it all depends on how this year and next year go for him. If they continue the same trend that was in his draft year season, then it's a massive reach. But if Minnesota believes that they have a player here who they can, who's skating they can improve, who they can like kind of use his physicality and his playmaking ability to really make a power forward playmaker out of him, likely even at center, then you can start understanding how they came to this decision. Yeah. I wouldn't have made the pick, and I'm not sure if Stramel would figure my top 5 Minnesota Wild prospects. I would throw Öhgren in that mix and Danila Yurov as well ahead of Stramel. Sure. And even on defense, a guy like Brock Faber is someone I've liked a lot in the last few years. And there's some other good names on defense too, guys like Carson Lambos and Kyle Masters and Ryan Healy. But Really, Brock Faber is my favorite one in that bunch.
Yeah.
And him and Strame would kind of be a toss-up for me if we're trying to rank the top prospects in this pool.
Absolutely makes sense. Now, speaking of Danila Yurov, his game's progressed. He's still having that struggle in terms of finding ice time in the KHL. It was a big issue in his draft year where he was playing at most 3 minutes a night, 6 minutes a night in the KHL. And most of the time, there were a lot of games where he was dressed in the KHL, but sat on the bench the entire time. So didn't hop on the ice for a single shift, which is just very unfortunate if you're a scout trying to, watch a game to watch a specific player and you see him on the bench sulking and not hopping on the ice a single time. It is a bit concerned, but with Yurov, I mean, the playmaking is really solid. He's able to find space really well and get that shot off extremely well. I was also impressed with the levels of intensity and defensive game that he showed in flashes, which is something that can absolutely be built around and developed, which is like, for me, that kind of puts Yurov as probably the runner-up to Jesper Wallstedt in that top 5. But there are some really good contenders in there. You mentioned Brock Faber. I love Brock Faber. I'm a big fan of the game, of his game and what he brings. He's already played 2 NHL games so far and not looked out of place necessarily. Definitely needs to kind of work on the more kind of well-rounded elements of his game and impact the games in more ways, and the specialist kind of profile that he brings to the game. But for me, one guy we haven't mentioned who I'm decently impressed with is David Spacek. He's always played a very solid role on every international lineup he's played on. He's played really well for the Sherbrooke Phoenix in his draft year, and the year after when he was drafted in the QMJHL. Was mainly their power play quarterback. I'm not sure if that kind of reflects what he'll be at the pro level, but definitely the type of guy who's going to shut down opposition. He's going to lay hits hard. He's going to use his skating and reach to get around the ice and impact the game and disrupt plays for opponents. So there's a lot to love in this kind of pool of defensemen. But for me, the standouts are mainly forward, right? I mean,
for sure.
We haven't even talked about Riley Heidt. Yeah,
I was going to set you up for Riley Heidt, but I'll talk about Liam Öhgren first. He's probably my second favorite player in this entire pool, behind Jesper Wallstedt. This is a player who should have gone higher than he did in 2022. I think that Minnesota was quite lucky to snatch him where they did. And he was also part of the same return as Brock Faber in that Kevin Fiala trade. But Liam Öhgren plays with tremendous intensity. He is a really great checking forward. And I mean that in a very skilled mold, not like a bottom 6 necessarily projection. He could be a really effective checking forward on a second line who makes the lives of both of his line mates so much easier. He was the biggest part, in my view, of the success and chemistry of his line with Lekaramäki and Noah Östlund in his draft year season, where they were playing together both with their clubs and also internationally. But he was what I thought kept them ticking, and he made space for his line mates, and he let them showcase their skill, and he also has a ton of skill. I still like his projection a ton, and I think he fits quite seamlessly in this pool of intense and defensively responsible players, like guys like Yurov and Rossi and Kusnedinov are all in that same mold of intensity and defensive ability, but Öhgren also adds a layer of physicality that the others don't quite achieve.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of the 3, Öhgren has always been the more projectable one.
For sure.
His game is very translatable, very mature and pro ready, which is really going to help him climb the ranks quickly. And very, very quickly on Riley Heidt, I had him in the top 15 in
You're a big
my
fan.
rankings. I'm a big fan of his. I love the playmaking, and I also love the intensity and the grit and nastiness that he brings to the game at times. If a player only has smarts or only has intensity, I'm not too impressed. And usually I don't rank him as high as that, but for me, it's a combination for Heidt. He can impact the game in so many ways, but he can thread passes, and I've grown to like his shot as well. So he's a player I'm going to keep a close look on as he continues to develop in the WHL, but he's looking really good in the 60s for Minnesota so far.
For sure.
But that wraps things up for our first segment. Now we're going to be talking about the Philadelphia Flyers, moving on to our second segment there. But before we get into that, Sebastian, talk us through our sponsor for today's episode.
Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every single time that they win in the regular season. Just pick any team you want to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory of theirs in the entire season. You can use those bonus bets on anything ranging from spreads to player props to over and unders and far, far more. So visit fanduel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's fanduel.com/lockedon.
All right, so moving on to our second segment and our first team of the top 10. The Philadelphia Flyers are our 10th overall prospect pool. Now, a couple things explain this. First and foremost, our addition of Matvei Michkov has greatly impressed the both of us and has helped in terms of the outlook and what we think they could become, based on who they have in the pool. For me, that addition of Michkov at 7th overall, a pure steal. I'm a huge fan of what Michkov brings, and I was extremely, extremely surprised to see him slip outside of the top 5. When the Montreal Canadiens didn't pick him up, I was both disappointed and astounded because they had repetitively said that they were looking for someone whose overall combination exceeds all others, and they're looking for the highest upside player. And for me, that was certainly Matvei Michkov. They had mentioned that they were looking for a player with character and intensity and all that stuff. But if the skill level was high enough that it compensated for lack in other areas, that they would take that pick. So for me, Daniel Briere, that change, I don't think this pick happens without it, right? I mean, he just fits the idea of what a player like Daniel Briere wants a team to look like based on the way that he played the game. But we do have kind of our separate ideas of what Michkov could become. We do have disagreements on certain elements of Michkov's game. I see his goal scoring ability as something that isn't necessarily elite. I see it as he has a great shot, not elite. What is elite in him is his hockey sense, his ability to flare danger. I think there's no comparable in the NHL. But I want you to talk me up on his shot, because I'm still not 100% convinced that he can beat goalies clean the way he tries to all the time.
I think that he has one of the most versatile sets of releases of any prospect we've seen in the last couple years. And I think it's kind of poetic that a couple years ago, the Flyers passed on Cole Caulfield and he landed in Montreal. And now the Habs passed on Michkov and he landed in Philadelphia. So each team got their dynamic sniper. But Michkov's shot, I've seen him score and get exceptional releases off of really bad angles, but also from really poor body positions. And he saves bad situations by just rifling a shot on net. Doesn't always go in, but he can create a rebound off of it because it routinely takes goalies unaware in the KHL, which is a really impressive feat. I do think that the gap between his goal scoring and playmaking is a lot smaller than the public may have in mind. I think that the playmaking is a really big asset and is almost as elite as the goal scoring. Mm-hmm. And while I would agree that the best tool that Michkov has in terms of goal scoring is his ability to find soft ice and to create opportunities for himself to get into goal scoring positions, I do also think that his finishing ability is among the best 5 that we've seen in the last 3 drafts. So I'm a really big fan of his goal scoring as a whole. And I think that Philadelphia made an excellent selection with him at number 7.
Absolutely. And it was really night and day between SKA and Sochi, right? I mean, you saw a completely different player. It was a massive gap. And the main thing is I saw a player in with SKA who was playing with the most urgency I've ever seen any player, the most urgency and frustration I've ever seen any player play. And I understand it because he's in his draft year. He's an elite prospect and he's playing 3 minutes a game as a 13th forward. That has to be disappointing. So after, when he's hopping on the ice and he knows that his next shift is in 10, 15 minutes, he's going to rifle everything on net and he's going to look like a headless chicken at times because he's just trying to put together a highlight reel. And it's not working out because he's playing 3 minutes a night. But when he moved to Sochi, when he became the centerpiece of that lineup, when he became their primary driver, was driving most of their expected goals, it was driving most of the results. And when he knew that he was going to be back on the ice in a minute, that kind of urgency dissipated very quickly. So I'm very interested in seeing where he goes from here. He's back in SKA, I believe, with their MHL squad, playing some friendly games. Matvei Michkov has shown his interest in coming to the NHL. So I don't think Philadelphia Flyers fans have to worry about that at all. So we'll see where it goes from here, but I'm fairly sure that Michkov is going to be a very, very, very good NHLer. So we'll see what happens there, but there are a couple other prospects we want to talk about, mainly Cutter Gauthier. I've been on and off on him. I'm having trouble kind of grasping exactly what I like about him, but it's definitely just, I mean, he fits the mold of a power forward kind of bulldozer very well. He loves to crash the net. He loves to cut inside. He loves to push pucks towards dangerous areas. I just see no delay in his game. And I don't know how that proceeds from there, right?
Yeah, Goetze is a player that has improved a ton in the last year, and I'll give him credit for that, but still would not crack my top 15 in a redraft. That said, I think that if the Flyers can mold him into this power forward, perhaps even at center, then maybe there's something that really exciting there in terms of an impactful top six piece. There's a lot of skill. He's a strong handler. He has a really hard shot. There are some nice playmaking flashes too. Like, his offensive toolkit is quite tantalizing. But as you said, there's very little delay. I don't see much patience in his game. I think he rushes plays a lot. He takes the first option regularly rather than waiting out to see if something better arises. So I wouldn't call him a true play creator. He's not going to be the primary offensive driver. But if you're playing him with Matvei Michkov, I think he would be exceptionally effective. So it all depends with how Philadelphia wants to play him and what role they actually see him thriving in. But as long as they don't expect him to be their primary offensive driver and a true play creator, I think they're going to get a really fun, perhaps second line power forward out of him, with first line upside, with stronger tool developments and learning a bit stronger of a delay game in there.
Yeah.
But I do like him as a prospect, and I do think he's improved quite steadily in the last season.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we haven't even gone into guys like Tyson Forcer, who played 8 games last year and scored 7 points. We've got guys, like Elia Desnoyers, who played some games as well. I really like their additions in this year's draft as well in the later rounds. Cole Knuble and Denver Barkey look like two very, very good additions moving forward.
Alex Ciernik, too.
Alex Ciernik as well is a fantastic add.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, they added a lot of skill in the mid and late rounds. I mean, Denver Barkey plays quite similarly to his teammate and first round selection, Easton Cowan. And he probably has a bit more skill, like raw skill, than Easton Cowan does, with perhaps he's a little bit less projectable and translatable, but it's a really fun swing. Alex Ciernik is one of the most skilled players that came out of Sweden last year in terms of raw ability. He's a tremendous skater. He's a really good playmaker. And while, yes, he is stuck to the perimeter quite often, and he's not the most physically effective, and the defensive game comes and goes, there's a nice foundation of skill there that could become a middle six productive piece.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We haven't even mentioned Devin Kaplan, who's been looking really good for Boston University. I like the progression in his game, the power forward elements that he's developing slowly but surely, and a couple of decent players in the deep pool. Namely, I really like Helge Grans and Emil Andre as a 1-2 punch in that prospect pool on D. Not a big fan of Oliver Bonk. I probably would not have taken him anywhere near the first round. But time will tell with him. But that wraps things up for the Philadelphia Flyers. Now we're going to end things off with team number 9, the Detroit Red Wings. We'll talk about it on this episode of Locked On NHL Prospects. All right, so to wrap things off for today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Detroit Red Wings, team number 9 in our prospect pool rankings. The Red Wings have a very interesting prospect pool with a lot of decent pieces. What mainly sets them apart for me, first and foremost, would be that trio of defensive prospects in Simon Edvinsson, Axel Sandin-Pellikka, and William Wallinder. That combination of just profiles of players alone, just Edvinsson and Sandin-Pellikka being such complementary pieces, I could very well see that become one of the best second pairs in the NHL. Maybe even a first pair if somehow Moritz Seider doesn't hit the expectations and this sophomore slump somehow continues or whatever it is. still, I mean, to have Moritz Seider already as a young defenseman in your lineup as a sophomore, in his early 20s, and to have Sandy Pellikka, Edvinsson, and William Wallinder in the pool, I mean, it's just so impressive to have that depth of skill on D. What do you think about that?
For sure, I think it's quite a luxury that a lot of NHL teams are going to be really jealous of in a couple of seasons. Simon Edvinsson is one of the most, I don't know. In his draft year season, he was the classic toolsy defenseman whose decision making was not the strongest, but he has progressed so well. I've really loved the strides he's taken in terms of becoming calmer on the puck. He's no longer deer in the headlights like he was in this draft season. He's learned problem solving skills that he's very comfortable using and regularly just solves quite complex problems. Even if it's like 2 forecheckers rushing him, he can get around them and he's still just skating the puck up the ice. And as you said, I think it's very complimentary to Axel Sandin Pellikka, where Edvinsson has learned to use his tools offensively while being defensively very, very strong. Sandin Pellikka has the opposite curve. He is exceptionally dynamic. He's a great playmaker in the offensive zone. He's a killer shot from the blue line as well. And he brings that element of dynamism, but the defensive game still needs some fine-tuning. I thought at the start of his draft year season, it looked decent enough, but I thought it trailed off later on in the year as his coaches were telling him just take offensive opportunities. And I'm happy he did. I think it really benefited his skill to just use it and try things out. But he will also need to learn to reintegrate the defensive habits that I've seen from him in flashes in the past. And William Wallinder is another very, very mobile defenseman who, in my mind, projects closer to a two-way piece than an offensive piece at this point in time. And excels in transition offensively. He changes angles regularly. He uses his skating to create bigger gaps from his opponents. And I've been a very big fan of his. I think a second pairing projection like number 4, number 5 defenseman is completely reasonable with him. And the skating is just a truly elite tool in there that helps him structure his entire style around.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's not even the end on D. I mean, they've got Shai Buyam, who's another very mobile, very creative defenseman from the back end. They've added Brady Cleveland and Andrew Gibson, which are the complete opposite in terms of just a pure shutdown guys who are able to break up plays and get involved defensively. But I struggle a lot with their decision-making and their skill level overall offensively. So they've kind of balanced things out with those 2 adds. But beyond the D, I think what also sets them apart is that trio of goaltender prospects. They got Trey, Augustine, Jan Bednash, and Sebastian Cossa in the prospect pool, which is
luxury.
That's more than a lot of teams have. There's a lot of teams looking for the next kind of high-end goaltender. The Red Wings already had Cossa and Bednash in the system, and they were just like, why not take Trey Augustine while we're at it, right? And just leave less goaltenders for the rest of them. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting fight in net in 5-6 years for the Red Wings. And then we look at the forwards, and I mean, it's not bad either. They've got the likes of Nate Danielson, who they just added in, Marco Kasper, who's looking really good so far out of the SHL, who even played an NHL game. So that's just looking really well for them at center. They have Theodore Niederbach, who I was a bigger fan of before than I am now. Same for Red Savage. He's a mainly kind of defensive, responsible center, projects as mainly a bottom 6 piece, but I think he's a very decent shot to make the NHL. They also have Liam Dover-Nilsson in the system, so I think their decor is fairly interesting as well, but it's mainly Marco Kasper and Nate Danielson at the top, and then a bunch of guys afterwards, right?
I would throw in Amadeus Lombardi in there. I really like what I've seen of him in the OHL, and I watched him quite a few times in Ottawa. He plays with tremendous skill and pace. He is, I believe he's playing with Flint, right? I think it was Flint.
I think it is Flint.
I believe it was. But he was their, like, by far their primary offensive driver. Every single shred of offense that they produced came through him. And he was regularly doing solo rushes, picking up the puck in the defensive zone, weaving through the neutral zone with speed and intelligence, picking the right gap. He deceives defenders by shifting his body weight one way before quickly exploding in the other direction. And he has a decent shot to complement that, and he's a strong playmaker, I would say that where his value really will come will be in terms of producing off the rush. That's where I've seen him at his most electrifying and most consistent. But even inside the offensive zone, he's learned with time to more consistently integrate his plus level tools to create offensive opportunities. So I'm very curious to see how he does against pro competition this season.
For sure. I think there are some ads needed on the wings, though, for the wings. Very convenient. I mean, I like Dmitry Buchelnikov a bunch. It's just outside of him, Carter Mazur is decent. Cross Hannes, I'm not completely sold on. Outside of that, it's pretty tough to find him some decent names. I mean, I think their next best guy after that is probably Dylan James, but I don't see anyone who reaches the quality of the trio of defensemen, of the trio of goaltenders,
for sure,
and of those high-end centers. So I think that's the next objective for the Red Wings, is to add some decent, winger depth in their prospect pool. Because now that Elmer Soderblom is officially a graduate, and he's looking real good. Outside of him, it's pretty tough. So we'll see where that goes, but I'm very interested in seeing. Yeah,
I will throw in one last name that I liked a lot in a couple of my viewings this season, which is Anton Johansson. I really liked what I saw of him in Leksands, and I watched him quite a few times in passing when I was scouting draft eligibles last season. And every single time I watched him, whether it was in J20 or in the SHL, he caught my eye on most shifts. I've really liked the skating ability. And while I don't think there's necessarily slam dunk top 4 upside here, I think he could be a really effective number 5 within a year or two. I was very, very impressed with him. He's one of my favorite kind of under the radar SHL defensemen at the moment.
Absolutely. But that wraps things up for our breakdown of teams 11 through 9 in our prospect pool breakdowns. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what prospects we haven't mentioned that you really like from your favorite teams. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, though, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about the sporting world, letting know what's going on in sports. And make sure to tune in for our episode on Friday, where we'll be breaking down teams 8 through 6, probably our tightest bunch so far. Those 3 teams, we had a very hard time separating them into orders 8 through 6. So make sure to tune in for that. This has been Hadi Kalikesh with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.